Trauma is something that most people have experienced, and without citing statistics, I think everyone, on this webinar can understand that point. It's something that most everyone has experienced in some way, shape, or form in their life. Now, the impact of trauma is broad, and it can be very significant. One of the other things about trauma is that it can be invisible. There's one particular thing I want to give you, which is moving from the perspective of what's wrong with someone to what's happened to someone. One of the areas where you're seeing more and more things happening regarding becoming trauma-informed within the legal profession are courts.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us for another Justia webinar. My name is Nina, and I'll be the moderator for today. Now, to kick things off for today, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Leonard Adler. Leonard Adler is the CEO of the Green Jobs Network, a leading online career platform he founded in 2008 that serves individuals and employers in green and climate job sectors such as conservation, sustainability, and clean energy. Leonard has a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center, where he was Public Interest Law Scholar and co-founded the Georgetown Journal on Fighting Poverty. He has worked to promote greater access to law and justice through roles at Equal Justice Works, FindLaw, NOLO, and Justia. He has a master's in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government and a bachelor's in political science from Stanford University. You can also find more information about his work related to today's webinar topic at traumainformed.com. The webinar presentation that you're about to watch will be approximately 1 hour, and Leonard will be taking questions from the audience, time permitting, once the webinar is complete. So if you have any questions that come up, please submit those by clicking into the Q&A button in the control panel at the bottom of your screen and sending them in there. Now, without further ado, here is Leonard to discuss foundations of trauma-informed workplaces and psychological safety.
First, I want to thank Nina and the Justia webinar team and Justia as a whole for providing me with the opportunity to be here with you today. And I also want to thank everyone who's joined the webinar. We're only a couple days from a holiday, so really appreciate you taking the time out to be here. So before getting started, I want to encourage everyone to do a self-care check. So just get centered, get comfortable. I'm encouraging you to do that because today's session is going to include a discussion of topics relating to trauma, which clearly can have an emotional impact. So please take care of yourself in whatever way you need to during this session. So your well-being matters, and you're in full control of how you decide to engage with this program today. So here's the outline of what we're going to cover. We actually have a lot of material to cover. And in fact, the type of material we're going to cover could probably fill up a whole day. We're going to try to cover as much as we can in an hour. And keep in mind, this is really intended to be an introduction. Potentially, some of these topics will pique your curiosity. You can then do additional research on your own. Depending on the feedback we get from this session, there might be some follow-ups to it. So really view this as kind of like as a 101, an introduction. So there's 5 sections to what we're going to cover. So there's going to be an overview, kind of some starting points to put everything in context. Then we're going to go focus on an introduction to what is trauma and unpacking that a bit. Then we're going to discuss trauma-informed organizations, provide an introduction to psychological safety, and then discussing this in context with the legal profession. So first, some starting points as we kind of get ourselves in context. So there are a couple times during the session I'm going to ask you to reflect. You don't have to put anything in the chat. You don't even have to write anything down. These are things you can just reflect on. So perhaps just reflect on these questions as I kind of go through them. So the first is, do you feel comfortable sharing your ideas or speaking up at work? Have you ever felt in survival mode while at work? Have you ever felt triggered or re-traumatized at work? And are there any aspects of your workplace culture that you think impact the organization's performance? So answers to these kinds of questions are what we're going to cover in the material today. So specifically, we're going to be focusing on trauma-informed organizations, and psychological safety, with the goal being to give you an understanding of what these terms mean, why they're important, and how they can be considered in a professional context and within the legal profession. And I want to mention, the field kind of trauma-informed organizations, and psychological safety, in a sense, those are distinct. There's an intentionality around bringing both of these together in this session, as I think you'll see. There's a lot of overlap and synergy between being informed on both of these areas. So now while we're talking about, using the terms trauma-informed psychological safety, from my perspective, what we're really talking about today is becoming healthier, right? And more effective, both as individuals, as organizations, and as a profession as a whole. And before going too much farther, I do want to give a caveat that this webinar is intended to be educational in nature and is not a substitute for therapy or professional mental health services. And also want to mention, organizations vary significantly, in their size, their makeup, what they do. So again, keep in mind that this is intended to be a general presentation, kind of applied broadly. So obviously, your particular organization, may vary. And then briefly to kind of ground terms of who I am and why am I discussing these items with you today. And I appreciate the kind introduction from Nina. And there are a few different hats, I've worn in my career and life journey. So I actually grew up in a low-income household in New York City, ended up running away from home a few times. And there's some other challenges growing up. Was fortunate to go to had some good educational experiences, and I wanted to use my education to work on a number of issues that I saw growing up. One of them was around poverty. So this is a screenshot. I co-founded the first law review in the United States that focused explicitly on issues of poverty. It's still being published there at Georgetown. But one of the things I discovered over the course of my career is that in addition to issues of poverty in my household, really issues of trauma were as significant. And really what I've come to I think appreciate is that issues of trauma can be very transformative both for individuals and organizations. And I think there's a lot more that can be done. And so we're going to be talking about a lot of that, here today. And so why focus on trauma? Clearly, the term trauma, we hear it a lot more these days. And I actually think this type of presentation might have been harder to deliver it maybe 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm actually heartened to see much more attention being placed on terms like trauma and trauma-informed psychological safety. So that's, promising, but there's a lot more really that needs to be done. And so specifically in terms of why we're going to look at it, from my perspective today. So trauma is something that most people have experienced. And without citing statistics, I think everyone, on this webinar can understand that point. It's something that most everyone has experienced in some way, shape, or form in their life. Now, the impact of trauma is broad and it can be very significant. One of the other things about trauma is that it can be invisible, right? So compared to, let's say, a physical injury you might experience, let's say a bruise, the impact of trauma, in many instances, it's invisible. You can be in a conference room with your colleagues, 10 people around a conference table. Looking around the room, you won't know people's trauma background. So it's something that's invisible, which can make it at times a bit challenging. And so in general, in the professional realm, a focus on trauma is underserved. It's growing, but there's more need for more, right? And in the legal professionals we're going to take a look at, this is particularly relevant. And then a few things to just place this in context before we dive into talking about trauma in more detail. I think in general, I think people would look at the society we're in right now and really feel like there's more stress, particularly in the labor market. If you think about something like AI, there's significant concern. Will AI replace my job? Right? Other kinds of challenges. So there's significant stress within the labor market and society at large. And at the same time, there's a growing desire to respond to these trends. And so things you're seeing in the professional realm is that there's a growing attention on workplace mental health, well-being. Again, that's a positive from my standpoint. And also there's an increased connection between these issues and being effective and being high-performing as an organization, that these are smart investments that lead to good outcomes, a good ROI for organizations. And just a few kind of just quick illustrations of this. So within the legal profession, there's a survey done every year on the mental health of the profession by ALM. They survey thousands of people. This is one where they asked, do you feel mental health problems and substance abuse are at a crisis in the legal industry? And almost half of the people in 2024 said yes. So that speaks volumes. And again, in the face of these issues, there's certainly things like lawyer assistance programs and other things that have been, developed and increasing to respond to these issues within the profession. Again, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. So there are a number of things happening specifically in law to try to respond to this. But again, there's more that needs to be done. And then more broadly, if we take kind of a little bit broader view, kind of society at large, this is a poll by American Psychological Association. Younger workers are feeling stressed, undervalued, lonely. Again, you can look at specific statistics regarding mental health, issues that people are reporting. And in response to this, mentioning you're seeing, companies take some action. This is a live job posting at Meta, where this particular role, part of their job is to really help support the psychological health of the workforce. And this is another example of that at the University of Notre Dame. So again, the things we're talking about today, you can think of it as these are trends that are ideally there's more response that's beginning to take place and kind of on the earlier side of some of these things. There's conferences that are taking place that's specifically looking at workplace mental health. And again, these types of things are only increasing. Surveys on psychological safety in the workplace. So that's a little bit of context just in terms of what we're talking about, how it fits into broader things happening in society. So let's jump in and take a look at trauma and introduction. So what we want to do before we can talk about being trauma informed, what we need to do is to be able to understand what is trauma as well as what are some of the effects. If we have this foundation, even though we're obviously doing a quick 101, that foundation will help us when we take a look at what does it mean to be a trauma informed organization. So first, what is trauma? There are a lot of definitions you can look up and identify. There's no one single definition. But I'll give you kind of a couple things to get started here. So I think one way I think about it is that trauma occurs when an experience is so overwhelming or distressing that basically it surpasses your capacity to process it, right? So that's trauma, just to kind of hold that particular definition. And then secondly, trauma responses. We hear about that term a lot. And again, we're going to look at both of these things in more detail. Right, so trauma responses are the way that the brain and the body protects us during something that is traumatic, so during an overwhelming experience. And one thing I want to mention is that a trauma response that you have is nothing to be ashamed of, really. It's a sign of how your body has worked to protect you and help you survive. So now we're going to go through a little bit more of a structured definition. This is a leading part of HHS that has had a lot of things really in this space. So using some of their material to kind of create a structured definition for us, I'm going to step through what they call 3 E's. So trauma occurs from an event, right? A series of events or a set of circumstances that is experienced by an individual as physically or emotionally harmful or life-threatening and has lasting adverse effects on the individual's functioning in mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual well-being. So again, think of this as 3 parts we're going to take a look at. There's an event that one experiences that has effects. So that's trauma. So we're going to step through each piece. So the first of these E's is an event, right? So trauma can occur from a very wide range of events, right? So it can be an actual or perceived threat to safety, your well-being, or life. These are just some examples. An accident, think of a car accident, right? Natural disaster, think of an earthquake, for example, right? A medical crisis, violence or abuse, or severe neglect. An event can occur once, right? So a car accident occur once, or it can be something that occurs repeatedly or over time. And one thing to keep in mind is that trauma doesn't necessarily mean violence. That certainly can be a source of trauma, but it's not exclusive. So if you think of an earthquake, that can be something traumatic, but there's no violence involved, there's no intent involved, and there's actually not something interpersonal that's involved there, for example. So there's a very wide range of events. So then the second E is about experience. So the way something is experienced is a part of if something is traumatic, right? And so there are a lot of things that shape how someone is experiencing an event, right? So one can be power dynamics, right? Second one can be a developmental stage, something that may happen to you as an adult, may be very different in terms of how you react and process it than if you're a child. So there are a number of things that impact how we experience things, and that's part of whether or not something ends up being traumatic for us, right? In fact, the same thing can occur to 2 different people. It may be traumatic for one and not the other. No one is right or wrong. That's just reality. And then the third are effects, right? So some things happens, one experiences it, and then there are effects. And we're going to again unpack this a bit more coming up, right? There can be effects on one's mental and emotional well-being, your health, your relationships, your ability to feel safe. So there are a lot of different kinds of effects. They can be short-term, long-term. They can vary in how intense they are, how visible they are. So that's kind of a structured definition to unpack kind of what is trauma. Now, we want to understand, so as we describe it, is kind of what's happening. How does this happen? I would just briefly mention there are a lot of different effects. What's really going on? So we're going to step through a few things. So the first is what we call the 4 Fs. We had the 3 E's. Now we got the 4 Fs over here, right? And so some of this will, I think, be pretty familiar. So again, colloquially, sometimes these are described as trauma responses, right? So if you are perceiving a threat of some kind, it can be physical, emotional, psychological, your body's going to react in some way automatically, not consciously, right? In ways such as the things here. You might try to fight, you might try to flee, you might freeze, or you might fawn, right? So these are happening automatically, right? These are nervous system reactions that you're not controlling, right? So if you're in a stressful situation, one of these things will be occurring, right? And so in terms of the context that we're talking about trauma here, so what can happen is that, your brain and your body may be continuing to use these same responses we just talked about, even after the danger, right, has passed. And so again, if it's something traumatic, what I just described is more likely to happen, where your body and brain are still, kind of imagining that these things are occurring, right? So it might have helped you when the actual traumatic thing happened, right? Those were your survival instincts, right? But then the thing has passed. But the issue is that you're still reacting, and there's things about that are still taking place. So we're going to look at that in a little bit more detail. And before that, just want to mention, right? So when these things are occurring, there's nothing wrong with you, right? So your nervous system is still trying to protect you. It's there to protect you and has helped you survive. So definitely want to acknowledge that, right? So this is a book that some of you, who are here today may have seen. It's been on the bestseller list now for many, 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 many weeks, right? So one way to kind of think about what I was just talking about is what Dr. Van der Kolk, here discusses in his book, right? Which is that the body keeps the score. So trauma isn't just something you remember from the past. Trauma is something that you carry in your body, even after the thing has passed. And so as part of that, you may be reacting as if whatever happened before is happening right now, is happening today. So that's an important part of understanding what's happening in the context of trauma, right? So examples of this, right? So your body may still be in kind of a survival mode position, even though the actual traumatic thing is long gone, right? So these are some examples, right? You may be hypervigilant, right? You may feel emotionally numb. You might be in a safe situation yet feel overwhelmed, right? Perhaps you're sitting in a conference room and suddenly there's some emotions or feelings you're getting that are not about what's happening in the room, but it could be things that are reactions from the past, right? There can be other physical symptoms, things like that. So these things are happening, right, because of changes that occurred kind of in the brain and nervous system because of what's happened through a traumatic experience or experiences. So to look at this a little bit more, right? So this is kind of a brief snapshot of the brain, so that we're not going to go into in-depth neurobiology, but briefly to kind of provide a little bit of insight into what's happening, right? So when something traumatic is occurring, we're describing, we had those responses that were taking place. So there can be changes because of things that happen with trauma in the brain. So just briefly, so different parts of the brain, right? So one is the amygdala. You think of that as your smoke alarm. It helps you detect threats, right? So in the presence of trauma, potentially what happens is that it can become more sensitive and overactive. So even though the fire is out, the fire alarm can be stuck, right, in a sense. And so you may be potentially, someone who's experienced trauma may be hypervigilant even after trauma has passed, right? Other parts of the brain that are affected by trauma, one is the prefrontal cortex, right? Impacts executive function. You can think of issues potentially around emotional regulation, right? The brain has been affected by trauma, so there may be things that happen after the trauma has passed. And same thing with the hippocampus, which affects memory. There are potentially folks who've experienced trauma. There can be issues regarding memory. So these are all, changes that occur because of trauma that are part of the things that we're looking at regarding the effects. And so we're going to just step through kind of pulling some of this together to step through some of these effects that can occur because of trauma and these effects inside the body, the brain, and the nervous system. So just briefly, right? So one, emotional regulation. So trauma can, and in all instances, doesn't want to mention, it doesn't mean it will, and also doesn't mean that there isn't recovery from these things as well. But just so we understand what can occur potentially here, right? So on the emotional side, someone who experienced trauma may have issues regarding emotional regulation. There may be issues regarding their ability to trust or feel safe with other people, right, in the present moment may not feel as safe because of something traumatic that has happened. And in terms of on the cognitive side, potentially there may be things that affect memory, the ability to concentrate, make decisions in stressful situations, potentially may have kind of black and white thinking or being able to judge things realistically. On the relationship side, again, the ability to trust, maintain boundaries. And if we take a moment to think about how some of these things might play out in the legal profession, I think one can imagine how some of these issues would be very important to be aware of, if one works in the legal profession. And the last couple things, again, trauma can affect perceptions and beliefs, how someone looks at the world or looks at themselves. And then lastly, it can have physical and mental health effects. Again, we've talked a little bit about that. Again, there's lots of surveys that speak to this and a lot of in-depth research that speaks to a lot of these issues. So last couple things before we kind of wrap up our kind of trauma definitions, kind of one-on-one here. So there are a few other terms I think are useful to just put out as part of kind of, we'll call it like a basic vocabulary you may have heard about, I think worth mentioning here. So one is complex trauma, right? So think of a car accident as an acute, right? Something happened, boom, there was an accident, that happened, and then it's done in a sense, at least that event. Now, there can be complex trauma where someone is exposed to repeated traumas over time. You can imagine, unfortunately, let's say a child that's in an abusive household or things like that, right? So there's a term for that called complex trauma, right, to distinguish it from other trauma we've been talking about. Other things, again, you've probably heard about PTSD, right, that mental health condition. I think folks are aware of that. There's something else probably not quite as well known. It's called complex PTSD, right, which can occur, again, think of it as something that might have occurred in potentially like in a complex trauma environment. So think about a prisoner of war who's been in a highly stressful, traumatic situation for years potentially, right? Or a situation where one's been in a long-term abuse environment. And in both those environments, people felt there was no escape or there wasn't an escape. There's something called complex PTSD or CPT, SD on that. A few last terms here. So there's something called adverse childhood experiences. This really arises kind of from the health field. There's a lot of research one can do on that. There's kind of surveys where people are asked, different things that potentially are traumatic during childhood, and there's scores and there's correlations between long-term health. Other things particularly relevant, I think, for what we're looking at today are secondary trauma, right? So it's a trauma-like response if you're exposed to another person's trauma. So imagine you're a first responder, you weren't affected, you weren't part of the accident, but you may still experience secondary trauma, in the context of your job. And then vicarious trauma is something that might develop over time. Kind of people work in helping professions, as you engage with people empathetically with trauma survivors on an ongoing basis, it can have an effect on you from a trauma standpoint. And so it's a term of vicarious trauma. So again, these are things we're going to take well, at least mention this in the context of a trauma-informed legal profession later. All right. So with that, we're going to move on now we have a little bit of a basic on trauma. So now we're going to look at trauma-informed organizations. So again, I want to start out with kind of a basic definition. What is a trauma-informed organization? So kind of put forth that a trauma-informed organization is one that operates with an understanding of trauma and its negative effects on the organization's employees and those it serves, and works to mitigate those effects, right? So again, relatively straightforward. The organization understands it and works to mitigate it, right? And so again, you can see why understanding trauma is essential to become a trauma-informed organization. Without it, it's not quite as helpful, right? So in terms of becoming a trauma-informed organization, again, there's a lot of both literature, a lot of resources, a lot of frameworks and guides. We're not going to go into depth on this. It's really to introduce this here, but to give you an example of a framework, and then we'll look at an example or two, right? So you can imagine that a trauma-informed program, an organization, even a system, right, is trauma-informed if it does the following. It realizes the widespread impact of trauma and understands that paths for recovery, right? So it realizes the impact of trauma. It recognizes the signs and symptoms of trauma in clients, staff, and others involved. So it's able to recognize that, right? And then responds, right, by integrating knowledge about trauma into what it does, right? And then it prevents re-traumatization. That'd be pretty important. If you're going to be a trauma-informed organization, ideally you should be working to prevent re-traumatization. Again, as we'll talk about briefly when we look at the legal profession is unfortunately one where people who are engaged with it, there's the potential for people to be re-traumatized. So with I mentioned, we're not going to go through like an in-depth kind of framework or kind of a full training here, but there's one particular thing I want to give you as you begin to think about this, becoming a trauma-informed organization. And that's the perspective on this page here, right? Which is moving from the perspective of what's wrong with someone, right, to what's happened to someone. Right. And there's a chance you may have heard this in some other context. So if for a trauma-informed organization, this is one kind of piece or one small piece around becoming trauma informed. So the notion of what's wrong with someone, I'd say I would describe that almost as a standard thing. Someone does something, we might assume that someone's because of the flaw they have, right? Or they've got a bad attitude or something like that, right? So in trauma informed, one approaches it with a little bit more in a sense of curiosity, right? What happened to them? Before kind of coming to conclusions, right? So understanding that a behavior that someone may see or a reaction that you see in someone, it may be a response to a past trauma. We were describing that a little bit earlier, right? People may be responding in the present to things from the past, right? So being aware of that doesn't mean it's going to apply in every situation, of course, but this is an example of giving to yourself a trauma-informed lens, right? So you get to add that lens lets you see things potentially, if it applies, in a different context. So, and for sure, definitely want to state very clearly, doing this does not mean you excuse problematic behavior. This is not an excuse for problematic behavior, or you should lower your standards, right? But the idea here is that it enables you with the lens to potentially help people meet standards that you have in the workplace. So I think what would be helpful is to do a simple example, right? So again, keep in mind, this is a simplified example right here. So, and we'll start traditional approach, right? So a supervisor gives Bob, right, some constructive feedback during a team meeting, right? So the feedback's given, but Bob gets really upset, right? He shuts down and then he starts avoiding kind of team interactions, right? So that's how Bob reacts to the feedback that he got from his supervisor in the meeting. So how does the supervisor view this? The lens they have kind of describe a traditional lens that says, well, Bob's not really able to handle feedback. He's not a good team player, right? So he kind of draws those conclusions and things unfold kind of going forward. So I would describe that as the traditional lens. So if you have your trauma-informed lens on, this would be another way to think about it, right? So instead of kind of coming to conclusions right away, kind of what's the matter with Bob? Ugh, he's got problems. Okay, wonder if something might have happened to him, right? There's a little bit more of that curiosity, right? So the supervisor notices those reactions that Bob had in the meeting and then follows up privately in a calm, non-judgmental way, right? Doesn't start out with kind of something accusatory, kind of an exploration, right? So what happens in that conversation that Bob actually shares in a past job, not at this workplace, in a prior place, feedback was often used to humiliate people in the workplace. It was toxic, right? And so that happened in the past. And so when Bob experienced that in that meeting, right, it was a reaction he had. So even though he knows, he consciously knows that this workplace is not the toxic one before, he still reacted as if he was still there, right? So that's an example of the supervisor approaching this in a trauma-informed perspective and then uncovering something that otherwise might have got lost, right? So if we kind of look at this here, just comparing the two, right? So traditional mindset, Bob can't handle any feedback, versus the trauma-informed perspective goes, the reaction might be, doesn't mean it has been, but might be shaped on past experience, right? The comparison between concluding Bob is a difficult employee versus a trauma-informed one giving the space to have that conversation for Bob and some growth potentially there. And then the manager, on the traditional approach, well, based on seeing that reaction from Bob, I'm not going to give him any more feedback anymore, right? That's not going to be helpful, right? Versus the trauma-informed approach, where we just step through, right? Adjusting that, and now feedback is given in private, trust is built, and so forth. So you can see some of those results, right? Bob certainly feels better through that process. There's greater trust between Bob and the supervisor. The supervisor may themselves have actually been able, through this process, develop some additional skills. And as a whole, the culture becomes safer for everybody. And again, we're talking about psychological safety more. So you can see the benefits with this example. So again, these are just some examples of elements. What would you see in a trauma-informed workplace? Not meant to be all-inclusive, obviously. There'd be a sense of safety in that workplace. There'd be a sense of trust and transparency. There'd be some kind of peer support. People be empowered, right? It would be responsive to people's different experiences, right? People are very different. Their trauma backgrounds obviously may be very different. And there ideally be some things that focus on resilience, in this kind of workplace. So now we're going to move on, kind of touched upon being a trauma-informed organization, we're going to mention psychological safety. And as I mentioned, these two areas are not necessarily always discussed in the same context, but I do think it's important, and there's really great value in trying to really highlight both of them and potentially seeing where there are linkages between them. So for this, I'm actually going to ask folks. I'm going to take maybe 30 seconds or so, and I'll be quiet. And I'm going to ask you to do a reflection here. Okay. I'm going to ask you to think about a time when you were the most productive, right? Kind of in a professional context, right? And to kind of think about these two things, right? What was the environment like when you were most productive? And how were you feeling, at that time? So I'm going to pause, and then I'll bring us back in about 30 or 40 seconds. So you can reflect on it. You can jot on a piece of paper or type it up. If you want to put it in the chat, you're welcome to. There's no requirement to do that at all. But now proceed. Great. Thank you, everyone. I hope you found that helpful, and we're going to dive in now talking about psychological safety. So first, what is psychological safety? Again, number of different definitions. Again, one way to really synthesize that, it's the absence of interpersonal fear, meaning between, something you're experiencing from someone else, right? And so, in general, feeling psychologically safe enables people to perform their best in all kinds of domains in life. We're obviously talking about the workplace, but this is really true in any domain, right? So if you're an athlete, right, at home, school, different settings, right? If you feel psychologically safe, you can be your best, right? And in general, I'd say there's more recognition of psychological safety as a core human need. And I think folks are probably familiar with the hierarchy of needs there. And so the notion of incorporating this into that, you kind of see that more and more, really, that psychological safety is really essential. So now we're going to talk about now here in the workplace, right? So psychological safety in the workplace, at work, is about creating an environment where people feel like they can contribute, right, without fear of interpersonal risk. Right? So is it an environment where people feel that they can contribute, right? So do they have that sense and feeling of safety to do so? Okay. Right. So you can think of this as a shared belief within a team. Right? It can be at a team level, organization-wide level, where it's people feel safe to speak up, ask questions, concerns, share ideas, and admit mistakes, right? It's really important, without fear of punishment, ridicule, or other kind of negative consequences. So do people feel that freedom kind of be an authentic contributor in the workplace, right? So that's what it is. And then to distinguish it from what it isn't, right? So it isn't about avoiding conflict, right, or always being agreeable. That's not what this is. Feeling safe, enabling people to be authentic and contribute within the workplace, right? And so again, what does it feel like? Again, in this section, again, we're talking, I'd say, for a minute about feelings, right? And so if it's present, people will feel comfortable, right, bringing their authentic selves to work, taking risks in front of others, right? If people feel that sense of safety, they'll be more likely to take those risks, right? Brainstorm, give feedback, and work through disagreements together. So again, it's not about just being agreeable or accommodating. It's feeling safe enough, knowing that, yes, there will be disagreements, and we can work through it together as a team, as a company. So benefits, again, been alluding to some of them, but again, you can imagine where there are a lot of benefits from being able to have this kind of psychologically safe environment, right? So it fosters open communication, really essential for kind of a high-performing organization's trust and respect, right? And again, there's in different contexts, different settings, people may feel very vulnerable. So providing that sense of safety can really help people to really be kind of equal and active participants. And you can imagine if there's high levels of psychological safety within a workplace or environment, right, it really can contribute to innovation. People are sharing ideas and contributing and kind of sparking things, right? Versus if that safety is not there, you can imagine what it might look like and what it might feel like. You might have a lot of silence, right? Employees may be disengaged. People may be acting or performing purely based out of fear, not necessarily kind of at their highest selves. So again, having that support, that safety in the environment really can help bring out the best. And so to give a little bit of kind of context for this, right? So the term psychological safety, as we're kind of focusing on here today and generally in the literature, really kind of arose from Dr. Edmondson, right? Who was a Harvard Business School professor, and really brought out some research regarding this, particularly in hospital settings. And what she found was that the teams that had higher psychological safety, they actually reported making more mistakes, right? But reporting a mistake doesn't mean you're performing worse. They actually perform better because they felt safe to speak up, right? So it's that feeling of safety enables people to share, contribute, which can be essential for getting visibility, for getting people to take action within an organization, right? So it's, around a couple decades, so it's been growing as a concept within leadership training, organizational development, and team dynamics. You've seen this across the board where places like the Googles of the world, McKinsey's and others, really highlighting it as a key element of team effectiveness, as well as kind of the mental well-being of the workforce and positive culture. And specifically, so this is something from Google. They had something called Project Aristotle. Right? So they interviewed, this was a pretty extensive research project that Google undertook to identify what makes an effective team within Google. They were trying to find that out. So they interviewed teams, 200 teams from all across the business, all around the world, all kinds of teams, sales teams, engineering teams, a wide range, right? And so the research that they uncovered wasn't necessarily what they were expecting, in that who was on the team didn't make as much of an impact as how the team did its work, how they interacted, how they structured their work, and how they viewed their contributions. And so from this research at Project Aristotle, Google identified 5 dynamics where the top teams had it, right? And so the first of those 5, the top one that they identified, was psychological safety, right? And this research is online. You can, look it up, right? And so people being able to take those risks and feeling comfortable really is a key part of teams being effective there, right? And so rather than hiding a mistake, hiding a flaw, hiding a problem, the organization's not going to perform well if that's happening. Being able to see these things, identify them, work on them, improve them, innovate, and lead, right? And so psychological safety, it's getting more attention. At the same time, it's not common everywhere yet. If it was, ideally, it will happen more and more, but, surveys being done, it's not quite widespread. It's not the norm yet, but again, it's obviously trending in the right direction. So we'll use another example. We're going to go back to our friend Bob. Okay. Right. That's right. So Bob didn't really describe where we were before. Now we're going to describe him, right? So he's at a mid-sized nonprofit. He's on the IT team. One day he's in the break room and he sees a brochure for an upcoming fundraiser for the nonprofit. And turns out that about 5,000 copies are going to be printed and actually mailed out. And so he's in the break room, he's looking at the brochure, looks great, but he notices a typo in the date of the event on the cover. Now he's not really sure what to do with that. He's just in the break room doing his thing. And he's not on the team at all that's involved with this project, totally different team. And, he doesn't want to embarrass anybody or step on anybody's toes or getting in trouble, that kind of thing, right? That might be some thoughts that might run through someone's head, right? But in this particular organization, there's a sense of psychological safety. And so people are encouraged to speak up no matter what level, what role, what department. They're encouraged to be able to contribute and speak, freely. And so what Bob does when he sees this typo is he brings it to the attention of the, relevant person. And that turns out that, yeah, Bob was right. Actually, there was a typo in the date. They had the wrong date. And so they fixed the typo, right? And so what that did was they were able to fix the draft before it went in print. And so that saved the organization thousands of dollars and potentially some of its reputation or some of the effectiveness in the fundraising. So being able to speak up and contribute in this way was able to save the organization money. So again, there's a number of studies, lots of things in literature that show how psychological safety is really a smart investment that leads to outsized results. So again, like mentioned with trauma-informed organizations, we're not trying to come up with a full playbook today. This is really introducing these concepts. But here are examples of some things to keep in mind, really for different parts of an organization. Starting out with leaders. Leaders certainly have a significant effect on the culture of an organization. Whether or not there's psychological safety, leaders really have an important role. So there's a lot in the literature that speaks to that, right? So these are some examples of things that leaders can do, right? So if organization leadership makes it an explicit priority, right? It's explicit about that. You can imagine how that's very helpful from the context of the culture. Does things to facilitate different team members speaking up. So it's not just, things aren't just being monopolized. All team members are encouraged to contribute and speak up. Establishing norms for how failure is handled within an organization. I was mentioning before, kind of examples, are people being punished? Are people then afraid to, share failures or express that? What are the norms that the organization sets up for that, right? creating space for new ideas, even sometimes if they're a little bit crazy, allowing the environment for that, embracing, productive conflict, and again, being intentional around things and certainly celebrating things as well. So there are things that leaders can do. There's also things that employees can do wherever you are within an organization. So certainly providing feedback in a way that, feels respectful to your colleagues certainly can help, contribute to a sense of safety. Even if you disagree with someone, having kind of some norms regarding respect in that regard, actively listening, to your colleagues, and getting ideas from your colleagues, asking them for their opinions. This notion of having people feeling comfortable and safe to speak up, and when people give feedback that it's safe, taking some steps to do that, right? And then finding ways in from a collaboration standpoint, if there is an issue, what can we do together, to address problems? And again, these are really just a couple of very high level points, right? So at an organization level, you can think of an organization could actually provide training to leaders, managers on fostering psychological safety. Other things that kind of get in the way of communication, and are things being done to really celebrate, people's differences in the context of people have different skills, different ways they're contributing. Are those being acknowledged and recognized? And one thing that organization can do if, some of this is striking a chord, you can in a sense do an assessment, right? Kind of, we did that question at the beginning, that reflection question. You can certainly do things that are more structured and really kind of survey internally to find out, do employees feel safe? Do they feel comfortable to bring up problems and tough issues? Do they feel safe? How safe? For example, you could, have a ranking score on that regard. Think about what happens to employees if they make a mistake within your organization, and do an assessment of that. Are they punished, for example, or not? Or is there something punitive that's done? Are they, humiliated in some way? Organization connects itself. Is it safe for employees to take, reasonable risks? We don't want to go totally off the deep end, but is it safe for employees to take risks, right? And reflect on, are employees able to ask others for help? And again, are people's different skills and talents, being valued, being utilized within the organization? Do people feel safe to bring their full selves, into the mix? So that's psychological safety. And so hopefully kind of by stepping through that, you can begin to see some of the connections. If you want to become a trauma-informed organization, having a psychologically safe environment can certainly contribute to a trauma-informed organization. And so as we kind of move towards the kind of last part here, want to certainly discuss things regarding what's happening to build a more trauma-informed legal profession, right? And so some of the things we've been discussing so far, they can apply regardless of the organization, whether you're a law firm or a different kind of organization. The things we've been talking about, apply. Here we're going to give some special attention to things in the legal profession. So first, to start out with, the law and legal system and trauma are certainly things that I think are, it is important to look at how those things intersect, right? I think it is, as we're going to take a look at in more detail, the legal system intersects with trauma in different ways, right? In terms of what's happening with clients of the legal system, as well as with legal professionals themselves. There's a lot of intersection between what's happening and trauma, right? One thing we are seeing, and I view this as a positive, is that trauma-informed approaches are getting traction. You're seeing this more. Would you see this 20 years ago? Maybe not really, but you're certainly seeing more efforts now within the bar, the court system, law schools, and legal organizations. They're beginning to get traction, becoming more trauma-informed. So again, we're going to look at things only briefly here. And again, depending on interest, demand, there's a lot more that can present on these materials. So first, want to kind of acknowledge and kind of examine briefly the notion that legal professionals, there are challenges that occur simply by being a legal professional in the context of stress and potentially trauma. And so the profession itself has been, increasingly acknowledging these realities. And so you've seen things like national task forces kind of take a look and begin to, put forth recommendations regarding the challenges that legal professionals face. If you remember early on, there was actually a kind of brief kind of survey was mentioning that, right, ALM has done a survey every year regarding mental health challenges. And so there's a lot of things that are being surfaced regarding legal professionals under significant stress, report different kind of health issues regarding what they are actually experiencing as legal professionals, whether that's burnout You can see here on this particular slide, right? So 73% of attorneys and staff said they felt their work environment contributed to mental health issues. That, from my perspective, is quite a significant um, piece of information to be shared by legal professionals regarding challenges they feel in the profession. And so again, there is more and more data regarding challenges that legal professionals face within the context of being a legal professional, right? So it is a high stress occupation. And certainly, again, a lot of information out there that, in addition to it being very stressful, and again, things that are stressful can potentially be triggering. Go back to our trauma response discussion, right? It's high stress, and it can be very challenging to prioritize one's well-being in this profession. And so again, there's a lot of things that's been discussed, and the chart there is it's hard to read it, snapshot regarding challenges that people are self-reporting, significant challenges that people report as legal professionals. So we've discussed a number of things previously. One of the things you can recall is we kind of briefly mentioned secondary trauma, vicarious trauma. Those are things that certainly can happen as legal professionals, right? You can imagine different types of practice areas where people may be getting exposed to folks who are experiencing, domestic violence, for example, right? So, legal professionals themselves may be getting exposed to trauma in the course of their work, right? And so given the challenges that occur in the profession, the self-reported, things that we're seeing at the same time, and there are things happening, but there are gaps, right? There are real gaps regarding legal education and training as people become legal professionals, as they enter the profession. How much training are they getting regarding trauma, right? Awareness of it for themselves in the context of working with clients, psychological safety. There's still a lot of room to cover and to grow regarding filling these gaps. All right. So in general, legal professionals face a lot of challenges regarding issues of high stress, potential lack of self-care, and exposure to trauma. So that's issues that legal professionals face. Now, if we think about what's happening to clients that are engaging in the legal profession, so a few things to kind of just briefly acknowledge, here, that clients engaging in the legal profession themselves may have trauma histories. Just in general in the population, that's going to be the case. And then certainly people's engagement with the legal profession in certain areas. If you think of someone who's facing eviction, briefly mentioned domestic violence, you can think of other practice areas, someone who did car accident, for example. There may be trauma that people have experienced as they come to engage with the profession, right? And so potentially some of these legal processes can be intimidating for someone, can trigger, talk about being trauma-informed, people may be getting triggered and to be aware of that. In addition, right, the court system itself and adversarial systems potentially can re-traumatize people, right? So again, I think we can all reflect on what those systems are like and how someone who has a trauma background and engaging with it may be re-traumatized based on what's happening. And so there is, I think, increasing awareness of this, again, as we're going to talk about, in a moment. Right. So there's more awareness in the profession and there is more action. More broadly speaking, regarding stress and challenges regarding well-being, had some slides earlier that briefly touched upon it, let's say from the ABA, but in general within the profession, lawyer assistance programs, there are a number of things more broadly that are, happening and increasing to respond to these. At the same time, on trauma specifically, you are also beginning to see more and more as a piece of that, right? So there's both, as we'll take a look at within the profession as a whole, bar associations to really provide more trauma-informed education and then to implement changes to respond to this. And so before highlighting a couple of these examples, one specific thing that's arising from this is something called trauma-informed lawyering. So again, I'm just briefly mentioning it now. There's a lot of depth to it. Could be the focus of a whole nother session, right? So as we talk about trauma-informed organizations and provided a definition, we'll do the same thing for trauma-informed lawyering, right? So it's a legal practice approach that recognizes the prevalence and impact of trauma in the lives of clients. I'm mentioning how clients may themselves have trauma when they engage with you, right? As well as with other legal professionals and the justice system as a whole. So understanding the prevalence of this and the impact of trauma within the profession. There's trauma-informed lawyering. And ideally, implementing it integrates that awareness of trauma into aspects of legal work, right? Think about how you communicate with clients, other aspects of how the legal system is even organized to promote safety, right? Trust. And again, the goal of this is also more effective outcomes, as we've kind of highlighted from some of the other scenarios that we looked at more broadly within trauma-informed organizations and psychological safety. And so examples of some initiatives. So want to kind of, as we're moving towards the end, want to give some positive, some kind of inspiration, some hope here is that there are things happening. And so from my perspective, these are positive developments. And so there are things happening kind of in the judicial court system. There are things happening in the legal education front. And again, mentioning that there's some additional resources can make available. Right. So one of the areas where you're seeing more and more things happening regarding becoming trauma informed within the legal profession are courts. Right. So that is a major area where potential there's people maybe getting re-triggered, and people within the profession have kind of are beginning to understand and acknowledge that there's tremendous room to make changes here for the better of everyone. Right. So there's reports that have been being released on it. There's trainings. Right. If you want to become a trauma informed juvenile court judge, there's now kind of resource to help a judge kind of do that. Here in North Carolina, and this is through a Duke at their Bach Judicial Institute, they have a number of resources regarding, and they've done a lot of work regarding trauma informed in the courts. So they actually offered and provided training to judges in North Carolina, trauma informed specific training to judges to give them this trauma informed lens that we've been talking about today. It's amazing. And so same thing. And then the chief judge within the state of North Carolina did a whole task force, right, on ACES. We briefly mentioned that before, on how the court system, in a sense, could become more trauma informed. So from my perspective, there is a lot happening here. And again, just was highlighting just a few of these things. These are very positive developments. And then briefly in the context of legal education, really in training law students, lawyers, and others, again, there's increasing things. There's podcasts you can listen to specifically for trauma informed learning. These are just some examples. And again, when I was going to law school, these were not available. So it is definitely inspiring to see these things coming online. This is one example. This is another example here, right? So these are all recent within the past few months. So as got a last couple minutes, so that kind of concludes kind of the formal materials I wanted to share with you today. So what I want to do is to give us a moment, and I'm going to give us maybe about around 45 seconds or so. There's a lot that's been covered. Again, appreciate your attention. Is to give you a chance, since this ideally is all fresh in your mind, is to jot down one insight from today that you think you can apply in your work. Maybe something you learned. And if it's more than one, feel free to brainstorm away. But I'm going to be silent in about 5 seconds, and then I'll bring us back. Great. I hope you found that helpful. And then in terms of resources and follow-up, what I've tried to do as a kind of to provide some additional materials for folks today, putting together kind of in a sense like a little mini resource library. Ideally, we'll build it out, so there'll be kind of links to some organizations and other things like that. But as a starting point, put together it's a Google Drive folder that right now anyone can access. It has some of the material that we're taking a look at today, and some other ones we didn't have a chance to quite go over in total. So I'm kind of building that out, and the place you can find that all is, and again, the web address Nina briefly mentioned at the beginning, is traumainformed.com. So it's hopefully folks will find it helpful, and certainly looking for feedback and ways to continue to make it even more helpful for folks. And again, my email address at the bottom. Happy to either get your feedback, or if there's other ways can be helpful or collaborate, feel free to drop me a line. So with that, definitely want to thank you all again, time and attention. I'll turn back to Nina.
Thank you so much, Leonard. I do want to go ahead and move on to questions. We have a few, so we can go over those. If you do have a question that you haven't yet submitted, please feel free to send that in by clicking the Q&A button in the control panel and submitting them there. Our first question is from Carl. They ask, has there been any discussion or research around compensating frontline shelter staff who regularly perform euthanasia or interact with traumatic-centered experiences? I'm exploring the concept of what I'm calling cat pay, which has to do with stipends to recognize the psychological toll of that role. Do you know of anything in that space, or do you have any thoughts to share?
I don't know of anything off the top of my head, but I think it's definitely a worthy area to pursue, for sure. I mean, I think it provides, again, it makes visible many of the issues we were talking about. And again, I'm happy to follow up offline, with you, in terms of if there's ways to be supportive of that effort. So I think a lot more needs to be appreciated on that score.
Awesome. Thank you, Leonard. Our next question is from an anonymous attendee. They ask, can you provide some benchmark organizations that excuse me, can you provide some benchmarks that organizations can use to gauge their effectiveness when it comes to creating a trauma-informed culture? It seems at times like this, sometimes there are just buzzwords. I want to make sure that this is carefully curated.
Yes. What I would say is a number of the materials, and those were things that I was putting into that drive right now, are intended to do that, where they're I would describe as whether you call them like playbooks or kind of guides, really to help guide an organization says, yes, I'm really interested in this and I want to operationalize it. What would that look like? So I would say check out the traumainformed.com and the folder there. Just adding more things, really kind of today was adding more things. And so probably also going to add kind of a spreadsheet as well that'll simply have links to some organizations. I think there's another question or two in the chat that might be speaking to kind of organization. So really kind of the idea with traumainformed.com in a sense is to be almost like a clearinghouse portal kind of reference point for so much of the things that's happening in the space. Again, the good news is there is more, but then with that issue, then there's a need to kind of, okay, how do I make sense of things that are happening in the space? So I would say check that out, but feel free to drop me a line because we'll be expanding on it.
Thanks, Leonard. Our next question is from Marissa. So this has to do with the example that you used of Bob getting feedback from his boss. So this person asks, how do you handle a situation where someone like Bob maybe isn't able to reflect on being triggered or having that reaction and continues to double down on feeling justified or outraged with feedback? What would you recommend in that situation?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And I think in any management kind of situation, there's going to be context, obviously more context than this, obviously the Bob case. But one thing I would say about, let's say, my experience in the trauma space is that there's different levels of awareness and self-awareness that people have, and you can't do the work for someone else. And so in the case of Bob, I mean, even if you have a trauma from, let's say you know something about their background that may provide some illumination on it, but they don't have that kind of self-awareness. There's limits. And so as mentioning, that's probably what I would say about it is that you can't do the work for someone else. So then you have, as a manager, you have to be able to do your job, certainly depending on the reaction you saw. I think one might think, well, if I saw that reaction there, maybe I will give feedback next time privately and see how that goes and kind of whether or not you bring up the issues, the trauma related issues. You can simply try a different approach and see what happens there as kind of an experiment. Those would be some examples of ways I would reflect on that.
Thanks, Leonard. Yeah, I think that adaptability is really the key there, just kind of changing based on that person's reaction and seeing what might work. Um, the next question is also from an anonymous attendee. They say, what are early warning signs that a workplace might not be psychologically safe? How would you recommend I intervene constructively?
Um, we'll take the first part. I think is the easier of the two parts of that question. I think some of the slides were speaking to this. And again, I would encourage, if you are interested in this issue to really kind of go deeper into the materials. But, it's the opposite of what feels safe, right? So one of the things is, for example, a lot of silence or hesitancy or people reluctant to share about a variety of things in the workplace, right? So if someone asks, there can be a meeting and ideas are solicited and there's kind of a silence, right? Or so there's a lot of aspects to what, if it's not safe, both, I think there's kind of things you can observe, kind of like mentioned, you can observe silence, right? But also there's things you can feel. And so there may be things you can pick up on. And I think one of the things both in, I think the trauma-informed space, psychological safety is, being able to pay attention to our instincts, which I think a lot of things in our society today almost work against that, where we are constantly distracted. We are in a zillion ways. We're always on. We're always connected to the internet. We can be called at any time. And so I think things that enable you to kind of find a way that you can listen to your instincts after ex experiencing something and then reflecting on that, I think that will also give you some clues. Certainly engaging with people directly and asking them kinds of questions to maybe suss some of that out can help you uncover that. I think the question about how the other part again, was what can they do if they feel that it's wanting in this area?
Yeah,
Yeah.
constructively intervening is the words. Yeah.
Yeah. Again, it's all very contextual. And I think in any instance, I would certainly encourage people to do self-care first, right? So before trying to become a change agent within an organization, you have to look out for yourself. And so, and that's a degree of risk everyone needs to assess individually. So if you feel like it's not safe for you to bring this up, and it could be you don't, frankly. And so if you do feel like it's a risk that's, makes sense for you to take, one of the things I would do is potentially see if there's kind of, the term I would try to use is allies, is who would be an ally to bring this up? Because again, I would encourage someone not to put this on their shoulders, right? So, I mean, if you're the CEO, perhaps, or something like that, maybe something that's your job. But if that's not the case, it's to really think about really how you can, find people to support this rather than you having to be the only one kind of on the ledge pushing this, because these will bring up challenging issues within an organization, and it could be the organization is not in a place where it's able to handle it. So those would be some things I'd suggest keeping in mind.
Awesome. Thank you, Leonard. Our next question, we'll take just two more. This next question is, how do I distinguish within myself between burnout and trauma-related responses, both within myself and my coworkers? What would you recommend?
Yeah, I probably would actually suggest engaging with more kind of formal, I'll just simply broadly describe it, mental health resources. I think on that one, I would encourage more of that versus I may have my own thoughts, but as much as possible, want to encourage people engaging with, you know, um, professionals that really can provide that level of support for something like that, because it's a very important question that you're bringing up, and whether or not one decides to stay in an organization, whether one decides to engage in assistance programs within an organization or outside for yourself. I think to do justice to that, that's what I would encourage.
Thank you, Leonard. And then our last question for today is, how would you recommend balancing high performance expectations with the need to support with dealing with trauma?
I want to make sure I understand. Could you either say that again? I want to make sure I'm understanding it correctly.
Yeah, so just balancing having high performance expectations, wanting to execute at a high level, and then also needing to support colleagues or maybe even oneself within trauma.
Um, yeah, I mean, I think I hope I'm understanding the question right. Is I think the first comment I would say to that is about grace, and so to the extent that you yourself have a trauma background and have high expectations for your own performance, I think it's really essential to have grace. And again, the source of the person asked the question, the source of someone's trauma can vary significantly, but in general, experiencing trauma is something, where you already were in a stressful, difficult situation where you didn't experience grace. And so the kind of point is to not repeat that pattern, but is to actually provide yourself the grace on that, and knowing that you're only human. And certainly, if you've survived trauma that already, and resilient on that score, you should give yourself credit, for that as part of being someone who is high performing. And so I would just be mindful of grace regarding expectation. So great to strive, but be gentle with yourself is probably what I would say about that.
Thank you so much, Leonard. Thank you. Thank you for that insight and answering our audience questions. We really appreciate your presentation today. And thank you all so much for submitting your questions and participating. We want to thank you all for joining us for another Justia webinar. I want to remind you all, as I did at the top of our presentation, of the services available to you through our website platform, Justia Elevate. It's our innovative, feature-packed website solution that's designed specifically for law firms. It's built on a WordPress-based platform and offers tools like our Justia AI Writer to help you create effortless content for your website, as well as our AI-powered Justia Chat to enhance your leads. Again, plans start at just $82.50 a month when paid annually. So if you'd like to check your pricing, you can go to elevate.justia.com/price or give us a call at 888-587-8421. Thank you all so much for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks for watching. We hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did enjoy it, please click the like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos on law practice and legal marketing. See you in our next video.